Welcome to the Maine Real Estate Roundtable podcast. I'm Bobbie Grenier, your trusted guide to navigating the world of real estate in Maine. Get ready to debunk mortgage myths, unravel real estate mysteries, and learn tips to avoid costly mistakes. Whether you're an industry pro, an overwhelmed buyer, confused seller, or simply curious about life in Maine, this is the podcast for you. Welcome back to the Maine Real Estate Roundtable podcast. I'm your host, Bobbie Grenier, and I'm back with another solo episode. I want to start by thanking everyone for all the positive feedback on my last solo episode. It was great to fill you all in on the company that I work for, and I didn't get fired, so I guess I did okay. If you want to learn more about Trowoji and Baldacci Real Estate Closing Services, which is the company that I work for, go back and listen to episode 13. I also want to thank you, as always, for choosing to hang out with me for a while. I really love doing this podcast, and it's a learning experience for sure, and a lot of work. And while I do get some feedback, I would love to hear from you. Tell me what you think, give me feedback, comments, wise remarks, whatever you got. I want to know what's on your mind. You can DM me on Facebook at Maine Real Estate Roundtable, or go to the contacts page at mainrealestateroundtable.com and get a message to me that way. I work hard on the podcast and I love putting it out for you all, but I am finding that getting accurate analytics is a challenge. So let's do this the old-fashioned way and just reach out. Okay, so today's topic, we're getting into a critical issue that we all need to be aware of and talk about, and I am talking about seller impersonation. Maybe I'm wrong, but I feel like there is this hesitation and almost a shame about talking about fraud within this industry, especially by those of us that have been hit by fraud in one way or another. And I am raising my hand right now, and you should be as well, because if you have been in the real estate industry for any amount of time, fraud has affected you whether you know it or not. I'm going to back up a little bit and let you know what seller impersonation is and how it works. So seller impersonation occurs when individuals fraudulently pose as legitimate property owners or authorized sellers in a real estate transaction. And these impersonation schemes have definitely been on the rise. I have come up with 3 key red flags that may indicate seller impersonation in a real estate transaction. Let's jump into red flag number 1, and that is limited means of contact. If you encounter a situation where communication is limited to email, text, or maybe a third party, definitely a red flag. There's always a reason that they're unable to have a phone conversation, and I'm sorry, but everyone can make or take a phone call. Nobody is that important or busy. Part of my job for my company is getting those incoming emails, and that is basically the point of entry, if you will, for fraudsters. It's where they sort of dip their toe in or cast their net or whatever to see if we're going to bite. We are a big company and super busy, so I'm finding that my initial sort of screening that I do isn't good enough anymore. The email is usually saying that they were referred to us and could we help them with this transaction. And of course, that's what we do, so we want the new deal. And I usually would ask at this point if they have a contract, which they would send along. But now I ask more questions. Who referred you to our company? Are you using a real estate agent? Can I give you a call to discuss our services and some details of the transaction? Quite often at this point, I get crickets, but sometimes they will push on. So don't think that you would automatically spot fraud right out of the gate. This is not your prince from a foreign land that needs your help. It is a scheme designed to get buyers, title attorneys, closing companies, and realtors engaged in the transaction. And once the transaction gets set up and started, it will gather momentum, and it's very easy to go to completion if you don't catch it in the beginning. There is generally no real estate agent involved, but don't be fooled to think that a fraud scheme won't have a realtor knowingly list a property. If you even think that the seller is not legit, even an inkling, ask questions and ask for ID. This pushback in the beginning will often be enough to discourage a bad actor. So here's red flag number 2, and that is pressure to rush the transaction. Impersonators often create urgency to expedite the sale before you catch on to the fact that you have a fake seller and suspicions arise. They may claim urgent personal or financial reasons for the sale, pressuring buyers, agents, closing companies to skip essential due diligence steps. Part of this rush tactic could be selling the property at a lower price than you would expect. Again, they may claim some situation where it's necessary to sell the property quickly. And again, they are good at this, so it may seem to make sense to you. Another way to get a closing done quickly is for the fraudulent seller to insist on a cash buyer. And we all love a cash buyer, so this alone isn't a red flag, but when a buyer is weirdly insistent on a cash buyer, along with some of the other warning signs that I've talked about, then you need to be cautious. We, as real estate professionals, need to verify the seller's identity before proceeding with any transaction. My company has just signed on with a platform called Closing Lock, and all purchase transactions are going to be processed through this Closing Lock system. And this will not only provide for sharing information securely, including wiring instructions, but also has a very impressive identification check. It not only lets us know if the ID is valid, but will give us additional information like if the seller says he's in Boston, but it shows up that he is in Dubai, definite red flag. Once I get some time and experience with Closing Lock, I am thinking of doing a full episode just telling about the features of Closing Lock and how it is helping our company. The third key red flag that I want to talk about is not so much about the seller, but more about the property that they're trying to sell. This sort of bridges over into talking about vacant land scams, but these scams go hand in hand with seller impersonation. And over the last few years, vacant land scams have blown up. Here's how it works. A fraudster can go online and access public records to get basic knowledge about property. Almost all towns in Maine have their tax records, assessing commitment books, tax cards, all available online. And although this is super convenient for those of us that are doing legitimate real estate work, this is often how a vacant land scam starts. The fake seller will find a piece of property that has a land value only, no building value, and then as a bonus, because commitment books give the legitimate seller's name and often mailing addresses on the records as well, if they find a seller that lives out of state or not in close proximity to the property itself, it makes it that much easier to pull the scam off. So once the fraudster gets this basic information, it's sort of off to the races. They can search the public records, the registry of deeds to see if there's any type of mortgage or encumbrance on the property. And an unencumbered property is ideal because that means more money when the property sells. So as things stand right now, when our office gets a vacant land cash deal, we go on high alert. And you have to understand that once the buyer puts out the money and the scam goes to completion, that money is gone. These guys are ghosts, and it's next to impossible to track them down and nearly impossible to recover any of those funds. And I want to be clear that they do not own this property. It was obtained through fraud and forgery. And although the seller doesn't lose his property, if we're talking about vacant land, if the buyer thinks they own the property and they build a house or they improve the property in some way, then the buyer has invested a lot of money into that property and improving the property in a way that the seller may not have intended. So it just makes a mess for all parties involved. Now we're finding this type of vacant land scam is expanding to actual improved land. I recently was approached by a buyer, and yes, I'm air quoting, that sent me a contract saying he's referred to our company, said that the seller also wanted to use our office, and gave me the seller's email information, no phone number. But here's the kicker. This was a property that was valued at almost $900,000. And I did my initial check and everything seemed to check out. But what raised my suspicions is that the buyer was very hot to wire my company the earnest money deposit to hold in the amount of $100,000. So at this point, you might be wondering why I was suspicious of this particular deal. And it was really because this guy was so hot to wire that money into our account. He didn't want to talk about our fees, our services, time frame, title insurance, nothing. He just wanted to get that money wired into our account. So I told him that I needed attorney approval to hold that amount in earnest money funds in our escrow account. He responded, okay. And then I never heard back from him. But the interesting thing is shortly after that, like that day, I got a notice, a fraud notice from one of our underwriters saying that this guy was going around trying to sell property. And they named the property, and it was a different property down in southern Maine. And the property that I was looking at was in northern Penobscot County, the property that he was asking us to do the transaction on. So it just, again, you need to trust your gut. And if anything doesn't seem right, start asking questions because that little bit of pushback made him go away. And we really, as real estate professionals, need to be that extra layer of defense for buyers and sellers and make sure that everybody is taken care of. When you work for a real estate closing company, you are rushed every day. Everybody wants everything yesterday. And although we always try to do our very best for our clients, part of doing our very best is taking the time to verify that the parties in the transaction are legitimate. And if we have to turn a transaction away because we're uncomfortable with the parties, meaning that we suspect fraud, then please respect that, because so far we have not been wrong. And we share the information. We need to share information amongst ourselves and our industry partners, real estate agents. You need to talk to each other and share that information if you've been approached or had a fraud attempt, because that is what's going to protect us all and save us all. And I know that the common reaction may be to sort of wipe your brow and say, whew, I didn't fall for that one, but the next guy might. So let's look out for each other when it comes to real estate fraud and seller impersonation. And it's not just about talking with each other, it's about talking with our clients and explaining to them why we need to get their identification in the beginning, the steps that we need to take to protect all of the parties involved. And I think if we start that conversation and we communicate with buyers and sellers, that they are going to understand and appreciate that as real estate professionals, we're taking that extra measure to protect everybody. This has been the Maine Real Estate Roundtable podcast with Bobbie Grenier. I hope you enjoyed today's discussion and will share this episode with a friend. And don't forget to leave a review and follow the podcast so you don't miss new episodes. The content of this podcast is for informational purposes and not intended as legal advice or representation by myself or any of the guests on the podcast. Thanks for listening, and until next time, keep it real.